Walking, walking with you. Walking with you is my prayer. I'm going to ask you for a moment to go back to that parable just in case it left any of you with the questions it left me with. I want to invite you to imagine yourself on that journey, walking in that long, sort of incomprehensible quest with the people who don't know exactly anymore why they are journeying. And then I want you to imagine what it would be like to see that castle city rising before you and to think, this is it. We're here. We've arrived. Only to discover a short while later that in fact we're going to be walking again. I wonder if anyone out there has those days where you feel as if you are exhausted beyond measure from all that walking and walking and walking through a world of change. I know I do. Now, some would say that we are living in an axial age, which means an age of great change, an age that is actually completely almost reinventing itself. And I think when we look at our world around us, we could say this could be true. We are surrounded by new inventions. We are surrounded by new ideas. We are surrounded by changes within ourselves and our understanding of what it means to be a human being. We are surrounded by the changes, not all of which, many of which we would not want, that are happening in our planet. Life is change. The real becomes the remembered over and over again. Think about it. There are the passions of childhood, the blush of first love, the thrill of a newfound interest, the adrenaline of a new occupation, the innocence of a newborn babe, the breathtaking beauty of the sunset, the surge of a fresh idea, the taste of a well-prepared meal. All of these are there, and then they are not. And we face this irreplaceable quality in more mundane moments too. There's the dawn of a very ordinary day. There's the taste of kind of a ho-hum meal. There's the completion of yet another task on the work to-do list. We also face it in the most rarefied moments, which alter the very fabric of our lives. The last glimpse of a loved one, parting or in death. The last hours of a career which have consumed much of our life's energy. The poignancy of knowing that we are doing something that has meant much to us for the last time, whatever that something might be. As one wit observed, the best thing about change is you can change it. And I'm going to take an example here, an opportunity just to change something and do something we don't ordinarily do. See, if I looked a little surprised when I opened the Joys and Concerns book, it was because I was expecting to see at least one written entry in there. But some of you remember what it's like to have small children and lives that are full. So I want to take a moment and recognize something that's important, an important change in the life of this community, which is that tomorrow our community minister, Andy Carlson, is going to be traveling to Portland to get his credentialing. And we want to take the wishes of our community with him. He's in the back. So we just want to take a moment and notice that. I thought that should be in the book. So I changed the format. Now, if any of you thought that was really inappropriate and you're resisting that change, you can speak to me later. Because I think resisting change is just sort of part of how we're wired. Now, this is reputed to be from a letter from Martin Van Buren, then governor of New York, in 1829, about the pernicious new invention that he was really concerned about called the railroad. And he says, as he's writing to the president, he says, "As you may know, Mr. President, railroad carriages are pulled at the enormous speed of 15 miles per hour by engines, which in addition to endangering life and limb of passengers, roar and snort their way through the countryside, setting fire to crops, scaring the livestock, and frightening women and children. The Almighty certainly never intended that people should travel at such a breakneck pace." So there you go. when we are surrounded by change, I'm sure that Martin would appreciate that. That's right. The choir is rowdy today. Do you notice that? It's because they've been giving us so much good service this fall. We should thank the choir. They're doing a great job. When surrounded by change, we can often feel, as we know, overwhelmed. We can forget what's most important. And so therefore, I think it's important to remember that one of the most important tenets of Buddhism is the idea of being present and grateful for what is, which is often hard for us to do when we are surrounded by great change. So we're reminded of that question that we asked in our meditation, and we can ask it again here today in a slightly different context. But how do we express our gratitude for the particular opportunities before us today, even if they aren't the opportunities exactly that we would have chosen? I think when we think about change, it's important to look at our heritage of world religions, and particularly the Buddhist teachings. The teachings about impermanence, and the bottom line of these teachings is get used to it. So the name of the road we're traveling on is change. And as one Buddhist teacher quipped, the idea of resisting change is like trying to petrify watercress. The moments of our life are so delicate, like that small leafy plant, that if we try to capture them and preserve them, then we really can't. And we are stuck in an endless cycle of failure in that sense. We must accept change, the teachings say, and take some pointers along the way. So let's go back to this idea of whether we're living in an axial age. Religious scholar Karen Armstrong has explained that an axial age is one in which there are fundamental shifts in the way the world is taking place. And she sees this, for example, in the period between 900 and 200 BCE. This was the time when India produced Hinduism and Buddhism. It was when China produced Confucianism and Taoism. And as National Public Radio Neil Conan said, it's also when Buddha, Socrates, Confucius, Jeremiah, and many other mystics and philosophers created a spiritual revolution well before the rise of Rome and the birth of Jesus Christ, and therefore established principles of empathy, introspection, tolerance, and self-sacrifice. So that was a time when there was great change happening. So here we are walking with the other 7.117 billion human beings on our planet. Across these great changes we face, across the expanse of our being, in this age, many of us believe we are seeing an escalation of the pace of change. This is what anthropologist Gregory Cochran of the University of Utah says. He's looked at the variations between the 3.9 million DNA sequences which have been identified. And he says, we found many human genes right now are undergoing selection and change. Most are very recent, so much so that the rate of human evolution across the past 1,000 years is far greater than it's been over the past few million years. And in the non-human world, the United Nations points out that the rate of animal and plant extinctions is up 1,000 times higher than that which we saw recorded in the fossil record. So there is a lot of change all around us. And other changes too. Changes in how we see the world. How we see the size of the world, I believe, changed dramatically after the events of September 11th in 2001. And we're seeing and living with and living into and trying to figure out what it means to live in this very altered economy that we have inherited since the collapses in 2008. Changes in technology make our lives more exciting and also more worrisome, challenging, and costly. And if you don't believe that, just come spend an hour in our church office. We'll show you. There are large changes in the world, which mean that there are smaller changes in the way we do work and family, paid and volunteer activities, and in fact, the way we do church. Change is just a part of our day-to-day life. And this is what Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield says about how these changes come down to our most intimate activities. He says, living with a busy family, I often feel just like one of those Tibetan monks that I once saw making an intricately designed sand mandala. For months they bent over the ground, arranging the sand grain by grain, and once their most beautiful creation was complete, they cheerfully destroyed it in an act of celebration of impermanence. He said, well, I don't create ceremonial mandalas, but I do wash the dishes. And when I come back to the sink later, more dirty dishes have appeared again. And then I fold and I put away a load of laundry, and in no time that basket is full again. So in light of all of this, how do we let go of the idea that there is some perfect castle where all will be well for eternity, and perhaps even see imperfection as a gift? So going back to that fantastic castle city, and those forlorn and fatigued people for a moment, they had to come to a place where they could rest and receive care before they could go on. And even though they learned that this wasn't the unalterable refuge that they thought, or that they weren't allowed to just stay there, that they actually had to go forth and, in the spirit of the Bodhisattva, help rescue their entire community, the care they received still renewed them and allowed them to move forward. Because compassion is the elixir which offers them life. And the researchers who study such things remind us that this includes compassion for ourselves as well. Change and times of change require hope. And in the face of all these questions, hope is a big part of that compassion. Those who study the psychology of hope say that it's not an idea, it's not just a wish. Hope is actually a thought process and a learned behavior. People with more sense of hope, they say, have a greater sense of agency and a better sense that there are actually roads before them and pathways that they can take. So how, we ask again, do we invite in the discipline of hope and the balm of compassion? Life is change. And why does it matter if we recognize that? Well, for one thing, it can cut down on the resistance. Because if we don't understand that life is impermanent, we can be like that small child who tries to stop his bike by dragging his shoes along the road. And all of a sudden, all he's got is sort of burnt out bottoms of the shoes, and he's still going. So sometimes the smallest glimpses of impermanence become the ones we resist. Last year, I had what I certainly sincerely hope and pray is one of the most change-filled years I will ever experience. I hope that won't happen again. But I found in the midst of that the thing that I found the most annoying, the change that I really resisted, was that one of my neighbors had the nerve to cut down his tree. It was his tree. But it really interfered with my life because it's one of the trees that I see on my nightly walks. And I like to look at that tree, or I liked to look at that tree, and see the stars and the moon and everything framed within that tree, and he went and cut down my tree. With full truth and disclosure, I will tell you that it annoyed me as recently as last night. So it's funny how we resist certain things. Some of the changes that are around us are not ones that we want, as I mentioned before. Gene Reeves is the one who translated the stories of the Lotus Sutra into English. And he was a great adherent of the Rishoku Sakai Buddhist school. But he also tells this story. It's a story of a great physician who had many, many sons. And one day he was out paying calls on people who were ill, and when he came back he found that his sons had drunk poison. And he was a doctor. So he knew what they needed to do. They needed to take an antidote. But the ones who had taken the poison early on were so changed in their thinking by imbibing it that they did not believe that they needed to take it. And so he had to go through a lot of mechanizations of his death and all kinds of things to convince them that they needed to take this antidote to the poison that was within us. Sometimes the changes that are around us are like those poisons. They teach us that our greatest weapons are to be self-interested and self-protective, and that sometimes we numb ourselves by being cynical and not caring. I think we can all shudder at stories of children at very young age trained to be soldiers in other countries, or even those within our own country who are trained to be religious zealots or violent, brought up in a culture of violence. And yet we allow our own children, in many ways, to partake in a constant stream of media violence. We have so much information in this world of new technologies that we can be paralyzed by it and numb to the real lives of people that are right before us. So some changes are worth resisting, but sometimes, you might say, it's worth trying to petrify just a little watercress. So how do we resist change that's not for the best? How do we resist those changes, not just because they affect us, but because they harm that spirit of love and the growth of unity? Walking. Walking and singing and praying. And what are we to do? You are probably getting the idea that in a time of change, we ask ourselves a lot of questions. And that's true, because we don't always know the answers. Allowing questions allows us to admit that we are vulnerable. And writer and scholar Brené Brown has spent a lot of time thinking about vulnerability and believes that that is very important. Allowing that spirit of vulnerability is very important in times of change and uncertainty. She has concluded, for example, that what parents struggle most with about their children is allowing their children to have experiences where they actually encounter adversity. Most modern parents, she said, see their job as preventing their children from having any contact with adversity. And yet, what her studies show is that those children who have encountered some struggle or some adversity actually tend to be the most hopeful. Somehow, they have had to find their own fantastic castle cities and build them. So vulnerability means giving up on needing to know all the answers, on perfectionism. And Brown says it also means being attuned to our feelings and not numbing them, because they offer information we need to figure out our new path. So where and how do we allow ourselves to be vulnerable? Well, the last of the three jewels in the Buddhist tradition, there's the Buddha, the inspiration, there's the Dharma, which is the teachings, and then there's the Sangha. And the Sangha is the community. It's the community of practice. And this is the place where you are reminded of those sustaining truths, which in this rude and crude and indifferent world you might not always get to remember. And I believe this congregation functions in that same way as a Sangha. Even within this community itself, we experience change. And I, in my own vulnerability, will be the first to stand before you and say, as we experience those changes, we don't always know all the answers perfectly. Today we welcomed new members gladly into our midst, and we hope each one of them will bring their own ideas about how we should be together and change who we are together. But as we go through this change, we need to ask ourselves how we can be a refuge for one another in the face of impermanence and in the face of change. We may or we may not be living in an axial age, but either way, the reality of our times is that this is an area of great change. And within these changes, we need to know that we have places where we can be loved and cared for and held. So walking and singing and praying and being together is important. And as we do so, may we carry hope and spread compassion and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, armed with the knowledge that all life is impermanent. And we can bear to each other our little slivers of petrified watercress, those things that are too precious for us to give up. We may not find a fantastic castle city before us, but we will, in that spirit, find new paths and new questions. May we together be the ones with the courage to greet them with gratitude.